very happy to be here, very honored to be asked to moderate this panel. I certainly thank the Gulf International Forum for this excellent and inspiring second annual conference. And before I begin and introduce our illustrious and distinguished guests, I would like to share something with you. It occurred to me that today is October 17th, and I have a particular interest in the Sultanate of Oman, and this is Omani Women's Day on October 17th. So if I may just preface the panel's discussions by pointing out that the longest ruling leader in the Middle East, and indeed the MENA region, is His Majesty Qaboos bin Said, Sultan of Oman. And it has been almost 50 years since the Sultan has been in power. And I must say, and I think probably my colleagues will agree with me, that he was one of the very first to strenuously advocate the empowerment of women, saying that the development of his or any other society is indeed dependent upon the full participation of women. So that's a discussion perhaps for another day. I hope I'll be invited back to talk about that. But having said that and put in my Omani plug, let me first introduce our first speaker, who unfortunately has a plane to catch this afternoon, so she won't be able to remain with us for the entirety of this discussion. But our first speaker is Her Excellency, Dr. Hind Al-Muftah, who is from Qatar, and she is currently a member of the Shura Council. Dr. Hind has held a number of government posts, including at Qatar University, and she is going to discuss the growing exposure of women in policy-making roles in the region. So please welcome Dr. Hind Al-Muftah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And hopefully you are still awake and have enough coffee so that you will be able to catch up what are we going to talk about. And this is granted from me, Happy GIF Women Day. Is that acceptable? Yes, so we also celebrate in addition to the Omani ladies. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here with such distinguished people. And my speech today is going to be very short because of the short time and because I have another flight. So basically, I'm going to talk about the role of women in the GCC and how empowerment initiatives and the programs being taken over the last 2 decades. And I will give very special attention to the Qatari women. To start with, as a woman, we do all share the same dreams, and sometimes we might face the same challenges, and to some extent, we might have the same opportunities. However, when it comes to different cultures, to different societies, it might differ. And when it comes to generation, where I'm presenting here the 3 generations, my mother, and my two daughters, you will find the changing dreams, the changing opportunities, and the changing challenges when it comes to 3 different generations. And I believe it is elsewhere, wherever you go around the world. And to start with, I just would like to emphasize 3 arguments that I personally believe in. First is that the kind of challenges that GCC women witness in her life, whether that was in her personal life or in the employment, it's similar to the same challenges any woman challenge and witness in any other part of the world. However, the only difference lies when it comes to culture and how is gender stereotyped or perceived in the society itself. And the second argument is that although regardless of the increased improvement in the women's situation and empowerment politically and economically, we have to agree that the gap between men and women, right, it's getting increased over time for many reasons we don't want to talk about right now. And the third argument is that, well, actually it belongs To me, at least because I'm an Arab and I'm Muslim woman, there's a big confusion between what is Islam and what is culture. And I'm not going again to talk about it, but just briefly to take it into consideration while we are talking about Arab women in general or GCC women in particular. So globally, we can see how women are really progressing very, very remarkably in terms of their educational attainment, where today they are constitute more than 65% as an enrolled student in the high school and 39% of the university enrolled students. However, when it comes to employment opportunities, we are still witnessing the international perspective that women cannot access some of the male-dominated positions like the IT, the finance, the manufacturing, and so on, which in turn reflected in the representation in the international standards where they are still underrepresented and they are forming only 18% of the ministries and 24% of the parliamentarian and 34% only of the managerial position. So this one will lead us to argue, are we talking about gender equity or gender equality? And I will leave this a question for you to think about it. But the fact that raises itself in such situation is that gender inequality still exists, even though in the very advanced and democratic world. Moving to the other part of the world, which is the GCC. Needless to mention that the GCC had really progressed very, in terms of achievement and accomplishment and in the perspective of the politics, economic, including the women empowerment. And it is unfair to neglect the role played by women in such improvement, and specifically when it comes to the overall society. To me, I would say that the main reasons behind such enhanced role played by the women lies in those written factors that I'm trying to explain. But because of the short of the time, it's not going to be, will not be able to explain them all. But I would like to focus mainly on 3 points, which I really strongly believe that they are the base factors behind such women empowerment. First, I would say political support. Now, as our moderator, she started by Sultan Qaboos, and you will find the same thing in every single country, that without the political leadership support in pushing the women and giving them their rights, to be very active participant in their society, no single woman in the GCC would be able to move forward. And because of such support, we find that women are really passing so good and achieving excellent results in terms of their educational attainment. And you will find, that's why you will find GCC women are really progressing very, very obviously, and passing the male in terms of educational enrollment, educational outcomes, even in the higher graduates. And maybe I would like just to mention very slightly on the women movements that started earlier in Kuwait and Bahrain, but they were so influential to the extent that they led the other countries, even though they don't have such women movements, but to be more active, whether individually using the social media or through the NGOs, to push and put more force on the government to take into consideration women's rights when it comes to legislation and to establishing new institutions that take care of family and women issue. So no one can ignore how as women has been really playing very excellent part in transforming the Gulf society from very traditional society into very active in terms of women. However, when it comes to statistics, this is not the situation. We can still find and see how women are lagging behind in terms of ministerial representation, and the same thing for parliamentarian, even though of their very high educational attainment and the very supportive they receive from the government. Now, moving to Qatar, the country that I came from, again, it's because of the political support. It's because of, to me, I always say it's a state-led initiatives and support that led Qatari women to more achievements and to be a very significant part of the modern society of Qatar. It started back in the 1990s, where some people, and personally I would call it the golden age for Qatari women. and continued to the 2000 decade, and by 2040, the 2000 decade, it was the new era for Qatari women to be really active part in politics and economy, where by so we can see how women, by their educational attainment, by their economic participation, it's been increasing over time and time to the extent they've been really recognized and acknowledgeable in the not only in the society, but also nation-wide. The World Economic Forum, interestingly, they adopted 4 main pillars when it comes to measure the women's empowerment internationally: the economic participation and the educational attainment, and the political empowerment and health and service. I'll just talk very briefly about the first 3 measures regarding the Qatari women. So when it comes to economic participation, we can see how is Qatari women really progressing and becoming more active participants in the economy, where, for example, their representation increased from 27.4% to 53% during the period 2004-2014. 2004-2014, by the way, it was the era of educational reform that took place in Qatar. And by that time, the government was empowering and giving the right to women to even have an access to male-dominated education and specialization, including military, including defense, including engineering and IT. Today, I mean, if I can give you statistics, but I can tell you that 37% of the students enrolled in engineering and IT are females, including Texas A&M. We have this one also reflected in increasing their percentage as a decision maker and policy makers in the government sector to be 30%. And the good news is that today Qatari women represent 13% as entrepreneurs doing their own business, owing more than 150 million Qatari riyal. And even though, I mean, I cannot really get the exact figures, yeah, inshallah, okay. But it's getting over and over in terms of the really enhanced participation, which was also as a result of the educational attainment. Now, political empowerment comes side and side with the economic empowerment. It started in the 1999. If you see the lady over there on the left side, she tried to be elected. I mean, she went in the election of the municipality council back in the 1999, but she didn't. I mean, she lost. But since 2003 until today, she's been winning the 5 cycles. And she had always the highest votes compared to her colleagues. When it comes to challenges, again, I will leave some room to my colleagues to talk about. But to me, I would say there are 2 main challenges in addition to those all mentioned above. I would say something related to the culture and social, including the stereotypes, including the tribes, and how do they influence women's decisions, and so on. And the second one is really related to the women themselves, even though they are very highly educated and they are so with brain, minds, and so on, but they are not interested either in women empowerment or being a political or economical active person. Interesting studies regarding this issue, just regarding the women and how stereotyping is playing really significant role, is a study in Kuwaiti women and how their decision in voting being influenced by the male husband or brothers or to conclude, okay, I'm very quick. To conclude, I think, I mean, women in the GCC country, they really proved themselves, and they are really, I mean, existing in the public sphere, including the political and the economy, as well as other aspects of the society. And this would not be able to do so unless with the support, I still believe it is without the top-down state-led initiatives and support, and sometimes push, we will not be able to move forward even one step. However, I still believe there are some steps need to be taken, both levels, top and down and even bottom top. We still need more efforts from the government, specifically when it comes to updating and reviewing and developing sometimes the new legislation that are, you know, convenient to the new generations. We need to open a new dialogue with all the society stakeholders, including men and women and NGOs and media and all of those other stakeholders that really influence the decision of women empowerment. When it comes to gender quota, I don't believe in gender quota. I believe in efficiency and equity. However, when it comes to gender quota in very tribal societies as the GCC, I would say yes, we need gender quota, and we don't need it only in the political domains, but we need it also as much in the ministries and the economic and the other participation. And I will conclude by one of my Omani colleagues who phrased this regarding quota, which I totally agree with her 100%. Thank you very much. That was so good.
Our next speaker is Dr. Malik Rashid. Dr. Malik is from Kuwait, and she has been an associate professor of clinical social work at Kuwait University. And she has worked with youth and families and been very involved with the social affairs in Kuwait. And she will discuss some of the challenges for women in Gulf society. So that certainly may go hand in hand with your question and comments, sir. Thank you very much. Dr. Malik?
Good afternoon. I know we're running way behind schedule, but bear with me because I'll try to take you in a holocaustor for 10 minutes, trying to say everything that I wanted to say. So just give me 1 second to get my presentation here. Okay. I've been asked to talk about the challenges faced by the GCC women, and I will be focusing or take you on this journey to 3 main stations. The first one will talk about the challenges that are commonly around the world and the globe, no matter where you live as a woman. And then I'll give you a little flavor of the challenges that we face at the GCC countries. The second one is, does words and number means the same everywhere? And you're gonna understand where I'm going here. And lastly, we're gonna talk about the glass ceiling. So, first of all, the challenges, the common global grounds versus the GCC. As for the challenges facing women around the world, there are too many, actually. But I chose maybe 3 or 4 of them. I'll just go through them. Maybe Dr. Hind mentioned some of them. The first one is the patriarchy. We're living in a society that is structures in which men have power over women in general. The patriarchal society consists of a male-dominated power structures throughout the organized society and the individual's relationships. So power is actually related to the privilege where men hold the positions of the heads of the families, they are the leaders of the social groups, the bosses at your workplace, and the heads of the governments and states. So the second thing is the culture. And Dr. Hind mentioned something about the stereotypes, and they are everywhere. It's not only at the GCC. In all countries around the world, in all societies, there are these typical male-female roles, and most of them are stereotypical. And if women try to go beyond these stereotypes, they might face with like a war against them, and they'll be like really banned from the good woman typical picture. The cultural consent of the inequalities and honestly the approval, the hidden approval of women themselves. Actually, most women, a lot of them, I don't want to say most, actually believe on those stereotypes. And it is really hard for them to understand that they are being oppressed, that they are not being dealt with as second or the first citizens. They're always being looked at as this weak creatures that needs to be protected all the time. So lastly, within the culture is the gender-based violence against women, and I'm not talking about only the physical part, it's the psychological, it's the institutional, it's the laws, it's the unequal access to education, to job markets, like we mentioned. Like the job market for men is always the protector, that in the justice system, and representatives in all macho jobs where women are always asked to be like teachers or take carers and all the social services arena. Under the representation of women, and especially of the authority level, where family, personal, and the different levels of leadership positions and the conditions along them, the power against the women. Religion, and actually I understand religion as being very private relationship between any human being and the superpower that they choose, whether it's Allah or Jesus or supernatural, and that wouldn't be a problem, and we wouldn't be mentioning it here as a challenge. But when these religions are politicized and being used to restrain some of the, or marginalize some groups, here it comes as one of the challenges that all women around the world are facing. So it becomes problematic when it's politicized, and the denial of religion freedoms always constitutes the gender inequalities throughout the world. After religion, we talk about the lack of political awareness. And honestly, women around the world has been criticized of being accused of either being uninterested, unwilling, or uncertain of what they want from the political awareness. Awareness should surpass the empty, meaningless, flashy words when we say women empowerment or the political awareness. We need actually to start early on with the educational system and curriculum that actually enhances the critical thinking and freedom of choice and knowledge to all women from the get-go. It is not easy or just simply learn the word of empowerment later in life. The lack of quota to give the head start for women to prove themselves in the office. Lack of campaign funding, because women everywhere usually work as like separate islands. They really fail to work collectively to actually mobilize the demanded change for women. Political culture and all the inhumane, sometimes a negative way of dealing with political culture, and maybe sheds out some lots of good people from getting into the political scene, and especially women. Now let's talk about the challenges GCC as a GCC flavor, and believe me, they are spicy just like our food. First of all, I'm talking about the conflicting practices related to women. I'm going to have to use my glasses because this screen is very small and I'm getting old. So, okay. Education is, I'll just go through them. Education is open to all regardless of gender. Okay, but work is not. Freedom of choice when it comes to choosing your spouses. Well, yeah, but you can give up many of the rights, such as the citizenship for your children when you're marrying the non-citizen, government housing, marriage allowance, and lots of things. The government is responsible to provide all with jobs regardless of gender. Well, yeah, but there's written and unwritten exceptions of this. Constitutionally, men and women are equal. Well, in reality, they're not. Men and women have equal political rights. Yeah, but women are left out of the equation because they don't have some access to those voters. We have something called Diwaniya, where all the men are gathered and you can actually present your agenda, your political agenda, and get known for everyone else. Women can't go there. The other thing is that the hidden parties, we have political parties, even though they're not official, but there are, and they're exclusively for men. So if you go into the political scene alone or as individual and by yourself, you can never actually succeed. Political representation is present. Well, most of the advisory at the advisory level, not legislative, just like Shura and elsewhere. The only actually legislative representation in the political are in Kuwait and Bahrain. We are civil societies based on written constitutions. Yeah, but the culture norms are superpower above all the deciding the destiny of women. So we are civil, but we're running by culture mainly. Structural challenges and barriers, they are visible, just like the laws, the rules. Like, for instance, women in Kuwait can't sign for a surgery for their loved ones or even their children without the signature of a male, either husband or a brother or what, say not. Statistics, the variation in acceptance priorities for colleges and works and elsewhere. The hidden unspoken, and that's what really scares me. The hidden is the social conventions. We are liberal at the surface, but we are so conservative within. Ideology, the appointment of women in influential position has a symbolic meaning rather than being actually indication of substantial change. Cognitive schemas and self-image, and that's we talked about, maybe Dr. Hind mentioned it. It is easy to say that we have human rights or women rights and we have the movements in Kuwait and in all the GCC countries, but women are still thinking of themselves as, well, maybe the political and policy making is not for us. Let's leave those for men. Do words and number mean the same everywhere? Well, exactly. Do words and number means the same everywhere? Let's say that. How could this be a challenge? Actually, it could be a challenge because, for example, the quota needs to be supervised so it can lead to inclusion of women in policy making rather than merely just fulfillment of legal requirements. You know, with the United Nations and ESCWA, we are required to have some kind of representation for women. That's why some GCC countries are having the quota. Just a couple weeks ago at the UAE, they have the 50-50 Shura. But honestly, I've been speaking with lots of doctors there, and they said in some of the Emirs, they didn't have any, women who are like taking the challenge, that they have to put them anyway. So civil society and women movements around the world and historically and globally, they usually start with marginalized groups working for marginalized groups. In the GCC, it's initiated by women of elite status, and it stays there and exclusively for elites for a long time. Now, we need to actually change to the inclusion of women representation of all groups, capacity building of NGOs, organization, and collective action. Political representations versus the numbers versus the influence. Again, we mentioned this before, the global indicators. Just give me less than a minute to talk about this. With the SDGs, there are numbers and indicators. For the GCC, we always pass with flying colors. You know why? Because they're talking about education, health services, clean water, affordable gas and internet. Well, in the GCC, we do have all this. But actually, do these numbers actually telling the true story of GCC women? That's the question that should be asked. I'm going to go through this one. I don't need it. So, to conclude, the glass ceiling, it is there. And it's a see-through. So it's a see-through for women. You either look up and see those people and said, well, as long as I can see them, then I'm one of them. So there's no need to crack this glass ceiling. The other woman would look up and say, well, I'm doing all the work. Why shouldn't I be there and getting no authority? So it is there. It is absolutely fragile because it's glass. and it is breakable. So let's do that and just break heck of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I encourage you again to make use of the cards that have been made available to you to write any questions, which we will sort through at the end of our discussions. Our next guest is Nagar Mortazanovi. And she is a commentator for BBC, for Al Jazeera. Nazar is a journalist, a television host, a diplomatic correspondent, media personality, and she will talk with us about issues facing women in Iran. And I'm delighted to have that discussion. Thank you very much. Please. 10 minutes, sorry.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will sit here if that's okay by everyone. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So I just want to give you a little bit of history of the women's movement in Iran. Just to be clear, I'm not a women's rights activist. I'm a journalist, but I'm in touch with a lot of activists inside and outside the country. So I will be looking at the movement from an outside perspective, but also, of course, as a woman who's been impacted by all of their great work. So the women's movement in Iran is a long history, over a century. It goes back to the constitutional revolution, Inqilab Mashrute, and it continued throughout the Pahlavis, the two monarchies, until the 1979 revolution. Before the revolution, there was more of a similar top-down approach, pertaining mostly to family laws, the developments, the modernization of the country that came through the Pahlavi, basically plans for the future of Iran. There was a women's affairs minister appointed, the right to vote for women, so things that had been fought for but also granted. And lifestyle, which is something that there's a lot of focus on Iran these days, basically the visibility, the way the lifestyle was playing out in the society. But it was more towards a secular or even Western, the perspective that the Pahlavis had. So in a way, a portion of the society, religious, more traditional segments were somewhat left behind. And then the 1979 revolution came. Basically, all of the major movements in Iran joined into the revolution, which was the biggest, the massive movement, and women had a very important role in the revolution, very visible also. And then came the Islamic Republic, which sort of reversed what had been happening as far as the more secular Western portion of the society and the more traditional and religious. So in a way, it empowered to some extent segments of the more religious and traditional parts of the society, but secular and more Western women were left behind or marginalized or isolated. So after the revolution, just to quickly skim through, there have been pros and cons. Basically, the Islamic Republic gave power to a strong Islamic feminism movement, women who came out of that religious segment of the society and became very strong feminists and thought leaders, basically, to this day. And women entered various parts of the society from the various segments of the society, including religious and more traditional rural areas. Women entered universities, were more educated, generally speaking, and to this day they have entered political, socio-political positions in the country, from ministers to governors, vice presidents, members of parliament. Right now, the Iranian parliament has the highest number of women in its history. And then to other social sectors, like a high number of film directors. We were just talking about that before the session. Heads of banks, businesses, also in academia, 60% of, or maybe more now, 60% of university students are actually female. And there's no quota, so this is them trying to get higher education. A large number of athletes, despite the fact that there's mandatory hijab and a lot of limitation on what sports they can play, what international competitions they can go because of the dress code and the limitation. There's a large number of female athletes and quite successful in some areas despite the limitations. And then I want to mention some years of flourish of the women's movement after the revolution in the late 90s and early 20s with the famous 1 million signature campaign. There was a campaign launched by women's rights activists basically planning to gather 1 million signatures from various Iranian citizens across the country to change discriminatory laws against women. Mostly family laws, divorce, child custody, the right to travel, the right to work, and there's a set of laws, and there was a large movement and a campaign that was attached to that. And what was interesting about that campaign was that it was a coalition of various sectors of more religious or the Islamist feminist part of the movement together with the secular women who were basically having a lot of these meetings and trying to come up with a coalition and common goals and work towards it. And then basically, but in general, considering the 1 million signature campaign, what happened after the revolution and to this day is that the society went ahead of the law. So considering family laws and some of those that were changed after the revolution. And then in general, the development of the society was to a point that it's the general sense of the society is more progressive than what the law provides them. So there's a lot of bottom-up pressure or approach to what needs to be changed and how the legal system needs to catch up with what the chunk of the society wants. Then we come to 2009, the contested election, presidential election, and the massive green movement. Again, it was a very massive movement that sort of all of the other movements kind of joined in. But there was also a massive crackdown, and it caused basically an exodus of a lot of activists from the country, including women's rights activists and prominent figures. One of them is sitting here, actually, Ms. Carr. Thank you for coming. So after 2009, basically what has happened and still continues is that the atmosphere for activism for women's rights has become very sensitive, very securitized. And the fact that activists had to leave the country has minimized their impact as opposed to when they were underground. Launching campaigns or doing all these activities. And the activists who were left, who stayed basically in the country, had to choose more low cost or less political projects, more social activism, family, children, charities even, and less of that kind of campaigny women's rights situation. But the movement still goes on, continues inside, and some of them outside the country. It's in sort of a transition period because of the sensitivity, because of the securitized atmosphere. But women still do continue to have the demands and to have achievements, which I also want to talk about some today. 3 major, I would say, achievements recently. 2 of them actually this past month, where Iranian women were allowed to enter the football stadiums for the first time to watch men's games after 40 years. It's still limited, not equal number of tickets, not all games, but it's an opening. It was considered an achievement, something they had been wanting for years and paid a very high price, including a girl who self-immolated just recently and died because of this cause. And also granting citizenship from mothers to children born from non-Iranian fathers, which still some other countries in the region would be probably inspired to follow the path. This has also been something, an uphill battle because of the large number of foreign refugees, Afghan and Iraqi refugees in Iran. It was an actual demographic issue for the state, aside from culture and religion, but that was finally changed. It's still not completely equal to when the father is Iranian, but now Iranian mothers can jump through some hoops and eventually have the possibility to pass their Iranian citizenship to their children, and also equal diya, the blood money, or the compensation for when someone is killed or injured or whatever, which for women used to be half of men, and that became equal just last year. I have 1 minute, so I want to bring us to today, considering the securitized atmosphere and how the US policies of maximum pressure and sanctions, economic sanctions, have affected, in general, the civil society in Iran, and including women's rights. Basically, when the US government, specifically this administration, champions women's rights or these movements or these demands, what it does is that it contributes to that securitized atmosphere in the country. It politicizes the cause, and the ones who pay the cost for that are actually the people and activists on the ground who are working towards that. So it's basically not very helpful. And also sanctions, economic sanctions, have weakened the civil society in Iran, have basically put the society in a survival mode. Many people in the middle class are working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and basically the concern, when you're concerned for bread, the concern for freedom becomes secondary. So I guess that would be the general sense of where it used to be and where it is, and I'm happy to take any questions now or after.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Funch, and thanks for the Gulf International Forum for organizing such a timely event and bringing the issues of women in the region. That's really sometimes when we talk about women, like when we talk about security, defense, economics, usually women issues and women empowerment really take the back seats. So thank you very much for that. I've been asked to talk about the issue of women empowerment and the reconstruction of Iraq. So it's a big issue, and I cannot really summarize it in 10 minutes, but I will be doing my best, so apologize for any running over my limited time. So the viability of women empowerment as a cornerstone and pillar for having sustainable peace and development in Iraq been recognized in various documents by the government of Iraq, such as the Reconstruction and Development Plan, Iraq 2030 vision. They put a lot of Iraq's submissions to the international mechanism, as it is for the SDGs in the voluntary review, saying that the implementation plans are advanced to increase women decision-making participation, decrease the rate of unemployment among women, rehabilitate and reintegrate gender-based violence survivors into the society. A lot of efforts are underway in Iraq for the development of the National Plan of Action on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, in its second phase, which is an important and significant step for Iraq to have women participating in the decision-making processes, particularly in conflict resolution and peace building. Positive strides in women empowerment, particularly in the political participation, have been achieved in Iraq after defeating ISIS. Women secured 83 seats in the Iraqi parliament in the May 2018 elections, which is around 25.23% of the total seats. As you know, the Iraqi constitution established for the quota, and back to the point mentioned by Dr. Hind and by Dr. Malak, it's important to have this quota, but it doesn't mean much because there is a caveat here. When serving in the parliament does not necessarily translate into employing influence, political influence, and only a small number of women MPs command a presence within the legislature, within their political party, and with their voters. And that's definitely, if you can look at the current government of Iraq, you have only single women was included, and that's coming after the recent protest of this month. During the reshuffling, we had a female minister. Women have not been taken into consideration in this high position, high-level decision-making processes. This level of political participation seems to be largely conditioned and responsive to the political parties, particularly in Iraq. And it's risk reinforcing the pipeline of future women who are coming from certain educational and family background, and that risk having more reinforcing power within the political and family elites. Talking about the political commitment, in Iraq, you used to have Ministry of Women Affairs. That was abolished in 2015 and replaced with a Department of Women Affairs in the Council of Ministers, General Secretariat, and with gender units in various ministries. With that, it doesn't have, women do not have much of a platform to voice their concerns and what they wanted, particularly when it comes to reconstruction and rebuilding Iraq and having a social, more of a safe society. Women issues do not have any outlet to be voiced over there. Back to your point, Dr. Malak, about data and indices. Data and indices even tell us more of a different story in Iraq. Compared to men in Iraq, women in Iraq currently have lower rates of participation in the labor force at 13%, and only 1/5 of women's population participates in the country workforce. High rates of unemployment at 31%, and illiteracy at 62%. Iraq ranked at 121st out of 188 countries on the UN Human Development Index in 2017, and 123rd on the UN Gender Inequality Index. However, it's better positioned than Yemen and Syria. Similarly, Iraq scores one of the lowest, ranking 162 in the recently released Women, Peace and Security Index. Iraq ranked low in women's representation, employment, financial access, education, community safety, and security from domestic and organized violence. Iraqi women and girls' political and economic and social empowerment challenged by a number of issues. Let me start by the legislative framework, which is one of the main obstacles that hinder women's empowerment in Iraq. Iraq insufficiently developed and sometimes contradictory legal framework does not provide women in Iraq with the sufficient protection. as you rightly said, Iraq, similar to the GCC country, Iraq constitution established for equal rights for men and women, but when it's translated into laws, we find a lot of discrimination against women. We're taking, for example, the personal status law, where women do not have equal rights to marriage, divorce, and custody. The judiciary and public institutions are influenced by corruption, political pressure, tribal forces, and religious interests. The lines between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches are often blurred. Due to the distrust or lack of access to courts, Iraqi women's right to access to justice have been hampered, and women are often reluctant to seek judicial remedies, fearing social stigmatization. When I was with the UN ESCWA, Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, I did a study on the right of access to justice for Arab women, and it's across the board. When you see, you have at the same time, you have protective legislation. When it comes to practice, there is a huge gap. Gender-based violence is the women are experiencing violence by state and non-state actors, and that's at public and domestic sphere. However, there is no legislation to protect. There is a discussion to have the anti-domestic violence law that's been pending since 2015. Gender-based violence was used in Iraq as a method of war by ISIS forces. To this moment, we haven't heard of any case of bringing any of ISIS member bringing to the justice for those specific crimes was reported. Usually they brought ISIS members on the terrorism laws, but they never put on the war crimes because they committed a gender-based violence against the Yazidis women. Corruption, I would go fast because I only have 2 minutes, like that's 5 minutes ago. But corruptions remain the major problem in Iraq. Political parties are draining off the funds from the ministries. They control and take kickbacks for government contracts, resist anti-corruption efforts, and whistleblowers and investigators are usually subject to intimidation and violence. The fifth problem and challenge is the continuous conflict and violence in Iraq, which resulted with 3.3 million women and girls in need for humanitarian assistance and protection. It resulted to have Iraqi women had 1 in 10 Iraqi household, which is a high number. 80% of the female head of households are widows. So the country has the highest rate of widows. They represent one of the most vulnerable segments of the population and are more exposed to poverty, food insecurity, and exploitation. Of course, the social constructs and bias plays a key role across all these challenges. According to the Arab Barometer report, men are still favored over women to access education and participate in the workforce. I would like to conclude, but I wanted to be back to the event of this month, at the beginning of this month. They only prove that the situation in Iraq is really fragile. The country needs a new approach to achieve a transformational change when it comes to women's empowerment. Iraq needs to shift the conversation from the why, and I can see it to the whole GCC country, from the why on why we're having gender inequality to the how to ensure women are empowered and we achieve gender equality. Reconstructions and development frameworks outline the importance of women's empowerment for sustainable peace and development in Iraq. However, the strategy are not reflecting how to build safe and secure society for all Iraqis, men and women, where all rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. Without a comprehensive approach, what we're seeing now is piecemeal approach. The vicious cycle of violence won't halt in Iraq. Thank you very much, and apologies.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon in this very important conference. Thank you so much, Dr. Dania, for this invitation. Just for the sake of clarification, I was proudly a faculty member at the University of Qatar between 2004 and 2007. I am actually Egyptian American, and I am an associate professor of communication, media and communication at the University of Maryland for the last 12 years. All right, so in the limited time I have, I just want to start by saying that we cannot divorce women's issues from the wider context of human rights issues. Women's rights are indeed part and parcel of human rights. Whenever we see a society where there is actually a respect for humanity, for dignity, for freedom of the press and freedom of expression, a rotation of power in a smooth way, and a transition to democracy which is smooth and equitable, we also see an increase in women's rights. And we also see more empowerment for women and more visibility for the roles. And vice versa. Whenever we see a backlash in all of these elements of democracy and freedom of expression and human rights, we also see a reversal in women's status and their empowerment and their roles. So just to start out by giving a few examples from the Arab region, and then we're going to zoom in specifically on the Gulf region, which is the main focus of this conference. Of course, if you look at the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, you will very clearly see that our only sister that really succeeded in the Arab Spring, Tunisia, they just had the wonderful elections, and hooray to Tunisia. Good example of success for sure, and a good model, right? We also see women's empowerment and women's rights and women's agenda actually being boosted in Tunisia in a very clear way. Women have a very high level of literacy, very high level of education. They also occupy important positions and decision-making positions. They serve as judges. I just had a co-edited book come out called Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions. And my co-editor, Professor Amal Mili, is Tunisian, and she was a judge in Tunisia. Isn't that amazing? So we need women to be at the bench. We need women to be at the table so that they will not be on the menu. That's a very important thing to remember. Whenever you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. And I think women have been on the menu for a very long time. It's time for them to be at the table, right? That's a very important message. And unfortunately, this has not been the case with the other post-Arab Spring countries. We have seen detours and backlashes and reversals in the path to democratization and freedom. We have seen civil wars. We have seen sectarian strife. We have seen military coups. We have seen what has happened most recently, unfortunately, in my own home country, Egypt, with the crackdown on protests. And many of these young activists, bloggers, journalists were both young men and women, including Isra Abdel Fattah, who has been arrested and tortured. These are appalling examples of whenever you have a backlash in freedom in general. Women are also going to suffer because they are part and parcel of society. I always say women are half of society and they give birth to the second half, right? So we cannot turn a blind eye to women's issues. Oftentimes what happens is women go out and they strive for freedom and they are at the front lines of resistance. And once a movement appears to succeed, they're told, thank you so much, ladies. It's time to go back to the kitchen, go to the hair salon, do your nails, whatever it takes, your part is over. And I think it's about time for women to learn the lesson that if they're going to be at the front lines of resistance, they're going to be at the front lines of building their societies moving forward, right? They're not going to go back to the kitchen or the hair salon. They're going to be at the table. They're going to be at the bench. They're going to be professors, and they're going to be political leaders. These are very important things. So having said all of that, it's very important to understand that there are three very important levels of invisibility that Arab women have been suffering from. Invisibility on the socioeconomic level, which means that oftentimes their labor and work is not recognized and not paid. When I was doing my PhD research in a rural village in Egypt, I asked women, what do you do? What is your job? And she will tell me, she will just shake her shoulders and say, I'm not working. I am just a housewife. I am just a housewife. When you ask her how many hours she's working 12, 13 hours a day. Why does she think that she's not working? Because her work is not economically rewarded. She does not get a check every 2 weeks or every month. So that's how women's labor becomes invisible. They become invisible in the socioeconomic system, and that's the first level of invisibility. The second level of invisibility is in academia, when academics do not pay enough attention to women's issues and to Arab women's issues and to rural women's issues in particular, and they become a blind spot that, in my opinion, deserves more recognition, which is why I think this conference is doing a good job giving us this space and this forum and panel over here. And the third level of invisibility is invisibility in the media, when the media actually either marginalizes women or over-sexualizes women or both. So they're either not there, they're absent, they're invisible, they're marginalized, or they're overly sexualized, or all of the above. In every case, women are striving to fight against these different layers and levels of invisibility. And in doing so, they're really fighting three parallel struggles: a political struggle, a social struggle, and a legal struggle. The political struggle to free their countries from dictatorship and autocracy, side by side with their fellow men. The social struggle to free themselves from stagnant traditions, negative patriarchal cultures, and negative traditions that oftentimes have nothing to do with Islam, or Islam is being used as a tool, I should say abused or exploited, more specifically and accurately, as a tool in order to limit women and to halt and hamper their empowerment, rather than to give them really the momentum to move forward as it should be used. And I think some of our great panelists this afternoon have highlighted some of these stagnant traditions and this kind of negative mindset that hampers women's fight and struggle. And third, the legal struggle, which is oftentimes, I believe, like a blind hole. People don't pay enough attention. Laws matter. Laws do matter, and having good laws and removing bad ones are very important. And again, I go back to the good example of Tunisia, a country that was able to have women on the bench, as I said, as judges, and to also really get rid of some of the very bad laws. This awful law that, if a woman gets raped, the rapist can get away by marrying the woman. Some people called it like, marry your rapist law, which is like shameful. So that law got, repealed in Tunisia. Other countries like Lebanon and Jordan followed, and of course, other countries should totally remove this horrible law. It should not exist anywhere. Moreover, Tunisia issued this very important law, which is a law against domestic violence. And it did not just, against violence for women, did not just limit it to the domestic or to the, how much time I have?
2 minutes.
I haven't even started. Literally, I haven't even started. Okay, thank you. So anyway, Tunisia had a good law. Okay, let's leave it there. All right, so let's move on to the Gulf, which is really what I wanted to talk about this afternoon. And we have two examples. One is from Bahrain, and the other is from Saudi Arabia. Bahrain, of course, was one of the Arab Spring countries, although I would say it had between two brackets an invisible/forgotten revolution. We don't have time to explain that in 2 minutes. But there were so many roles for women, young women activists, who used social media as their window to see the rest of the world and to be seen by the rest of the world. Courageous women like Ayatul Jumaizi, who stood up in the middle of the square, the Pearl Square in Manama, and she, was very brave and courageous. She got arrested. Women like Maryam al-Khawaja, Zainab al-Khawaja, all of them using social media as their vehicles and channels of activism. A non-Arab Spring country that witnessed women's activism more recently, and of course has been all over the news, is Saudi Arabia, which really provides us with a very, very paradoxical case. And the paradoxical case is, while MBS is saying we're trying to promote women's rights, in fact, he's been cracking very harshly and very cruelly on women activists and women's rights activists. We have seen Manal al-Sharif. She had the very successful YouTube campaign called Women to Drive. Of course, Trevor Noah made the joke that, now women are given the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, but only after cars drive themselves. But anyway, so that is better than nothing anyway. And we have, activists like Aziza Al-Yusuf, like Lujain Al-Hazlul, many of whom have been arrested, tortured, and harassed in jail in Saudi Arabia, and again, attracting world attention. The fact is, very interestingly here, that something like the horrific murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi was supposed to really intimidate people. It was supposed to silence people and just give them the lesson. Don't you dare ever speak against your regime. Even if you are in exile, you are not safe. The good news is we have seen an increase in activism despite regime repression, or maybe I should say because of it. I think that the more there is repression, the more there is going to be activism, and that's part of my prediction. We have now what is called cyber wars. Cyber wars are very clear, and more so in the Gulf region. Why especially the Gulf region? Because it has a higher level of per capita income, it is very affluent, has a very high level of internet penetration rate, has very young population. We know that over 50% of the Arab world is under the age of 25. Take a country like Saudi Arabia, over 60% are under the age of 30. So you have a young population, vibrant. They really want change, they are change agents, and they are using social media. They're very technologically savvy in terms of using social media. So you have the concept of cyber activism, which means how people in general are using social media to advance their cause. And then you have the concept of cyber feminism, which means how women in particular are using social media to advance their cause. My prediction is these cyber wars are going to continue. And every party is going to sharpen its tools moving forward. The activists are going to become more savvy, but so are the regimes. The regimes in the Gulf, unlike, for example, Tunisia and Egypt, were not taken by surprise. They were well prepared, they have the money, they're affluent, they have the technological tools, they're savvy. So they started creating things like the cyber troops, the cyber armies, Azubab al-Electroni. So they go after their opponents, both in the virtual world and in the real world. In the virtual world through things like sabotaging, hacking, blocking, closing down, and in the real world through jailing, arresting, or even killing, as we saw in the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. However, my optimistic note, to end on an optimistic note, is that I think that there will be more and more young activists in general, and young women in particular, sharpening their own tools as well, because the young people, the youth, are the future of this region. They're going to use cyber activism and cyber feminism to push against their own repressive regimes and to make their voices heard for the purpose of mobilization, education, as well as enforcement of their own power and empowerment for the future. Does that mean that everything is done and we should leave on a great note? No. We should acknowledge the potentials as well as the limitations, as well as the future prospects, and we should really have the middle ground of cautionary optimism, meaning we should not be techno-euphoric and think, oh my God, now they have the technology, the internet, they're going to have democracy. That's how we were techno-euphoric, including myself, when we wrote about this back in 2011. In 2019, we are much wiser, I will not say older, but much wiser, and we learned our lesson that the technology is just a tool. It cannot bring about democracy or change or women's empowerment or women's rights all by itself. It takes a village to achieve all of that. So we should not really be cyber euphoric, right, and cyber optimistic, and we should not be cyber pessimistic either. We need to be cyber realistic. Technology is great, but it's only one tool. What about the rest of the picture? The social, economic, and legal aspects we need to consider. Indeed, as the subtitle of my book says, it's unfinished gendered revolutions. We can be proud of what Arab women in general, women in the Gulf in particular, have achieved, but we're also humbled by what remains to be accomplished. The glass ceiling has been cracked, but it has not been broken yet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed to